Father Peter had always been the pillar of St. Mary's Parish, kind, compassionate, and unwavering in his faith. But behind his warm sermons and comforting prayers, something darker was hiding. When young altar boys like Mark, Lucas, and several others began disappearing, whispers of abuse and betrayal began to surface. The man the town had trusted with their children was about to be exposed as something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. As the truth unraveled, the community's faith would be shattered, and the haunting legacy of Father Peter's actions would forever change the lives of those who had once called him a friend. Father Peter had always been the epitome of trust and reliability in the small town. The locals knew him as a kind-hearted priest with an infectious smile, a man whose passion for the church seemed unshakable. He would spend hours preparing his sermons, ensuring that each word was delivered with purpose and grace. The church was his sanctuary, a place where he had dedicated his life to serving the community. He didn't just lead services, he made a point to visit the sick, offer counseling to troubled families, and offer a shoulder to lean on. No one ever doubted his intentions, and he quickly became the cornerstone of the town's spiritual life. He was particularly close to the young boys who served as altar boys during Mass. Father Peter's calm demeanor and reassuring presence made them feel safe, almost as if they had found a second father in him. His love for the children, however, went beyond the typical mentorship a priest might offer. His fondness for them was often described by others as special, but no one questioned it at the time. After all, Father Peter was a man of God. How could anyone believe that such a kind-hearted, devout figure could harbor any ill intentions? In the eyes of the town, he was the perfect priest. Always there when needed, always willing to listen, and always putting others before himself. His church was often filled to the brim with people seeking solace, drawn in by his magnetic charm and the comfort he offered in times of personal struggle. It was impossible to imagine that behind those soft, caring eyes and soothing words, something sinister could be lurking. Even as he grew older and his responsibilities in the church expanded, Father Peter remained as committed as ever to his duties. He was respected by the town's leaders and admired by the congregation. He stood as an unwavering symbol of faith, a man who embodied everything people wished to see in a religious leader. For all intents and purposes, Father Peter was untouchable. His reputation was spotless, his faith unquestioned, and his position firmly entrenched in the community. But beneath the surface, there were secrets, dark, dangerous secrets, that no one was prepared to uncover. The first disappearance was subtle, barely noticeable at first. It involved a quiet, unassuming boy named Michael, a 12-year-old altar boy who had always been reliable. His parents assumed he'd simply run off to spend the afternoon with his friends, as teenagers often did. But when he failed to return, home by nightfall, worry began to set in. The local police were contacted, but their initial search turned up nothing. No signs of a struggle, no clues to his whereabouts, just an empty room and a growing sense of unease. Days passed, and still, no sign of Michael. The community rallied together, plastering the town with missing person posters and organizing search parties. Father Peter was at the forefront of these efforts, offering words of comfort to Michael's parents, who were beside themselves with grief. He gave the impression of someone equally concerned, equally lost in the uncertainty of the situation. As the days turned to weeks, there was no new information, and the authorities began to grow frustrated. The small town had few resources, and with no leads, the case began to grow cold. Then, another boy disappeared. Daniel, just a year younger than Michael. His absence followed the same eerie pattern. No sign of a struggle, no hint of where he had gone. His family, too, was consumed by fear and confusion. But once again, Father Peter was there, comforting the family and organizing prayer vigils at the church. The town began to murmur, but no one dared to speak aloud the thoughts that were creeping into their minds. Could these two disappearances be connected? Could something darker be at play? As another child, Liam, went missing under similar circumstances, the rumors began to escalate. The disappearances weren't just coincidences anymore. The town began to sense that they were part of something much larger, something sinister. But even as these suspicions started to take root, no one was ready to accept the terrifying truth. The priest who had led their church for years, a man they all trusted without question, was somehow connected to the tragedies that were tearing their community apart. Still, no one dared to speak up, not yet. They were unwilling to believe what their growing doubts were suggesting. It was easier to dismiss the truth than face it head-on. As more boys went missing, the whispers started to spread through the town, though they were hushed and cautious. At first, people refused to believe what they were starting to suspect, that Father Peter might be involved in some way. He was a figure of unwavering faith, a man they had all known and loved for years. The thought of him being capable of such acts was almost too much to bear. His involvement in the community, his kindness, and his gentle nature seemed to rule out. Most dismissed their growing concerns, chalking them up to paranoia or the exaggerated imaginations of a few worried parents. Yet, as the disappearances continued, some began to look at Father Peter through a more skeptical lens. After all, the altar boys were the ones most affected. These were the boys Father Peter worked closest with, spending time with them after services, offering them individual attention, and taking them on trips outside of town. While nothing had seemed out of the ordinary at the time, these interactions began to look suspicious in retrospect. But even then, no one could bring themselves to confront Father Peter directly. How could they? He was an institution. He had been there for their baptisms, their weddings, and their moments of grief. He was their moral compass, the one they turned to in times of doubt. Instead, the families of the missing boys grew increasingly frustrated. The local police, though well-meaning, seemed helpless in their investigation. Their efforts were disjointed and unfocused, as if they too were reluctant to acknowledge the possibility that Father Peter could be behind the disappearances. The authorities searched the usual places, asking the same questions, interviewing the same people, but the priest's reputation kept anyone from digging too deep. The church was a sacred place, and in their minds, it was unthinkable that a priest, a man of God, could be responsible for something so vile. Still, as more children vanished, the cracks began to show. Parents began to talk to one another in hushed tones, piecing together their own suspicions. But even with the growing unease, no one dared to voice the terrifying thought that had started to take root in their minds. What if Father Peter, the very man who had preached love and faith, was somehow at the center of this nightmare? The breakthrough came when Mark, another altar boy, went missing, only to be found a few days later, disoriented and incoherent. His parents had been frantic, searching desperately for their son, and when Mark was finally discovered, the relief they felt was short-lived. He was found near the woods just outside town, stumbling aimlessly, his clothes torn and stained, his face pale and drawn. His eyes were wide, as though he had seen something terrifying, something that had shaken him to his core. He couldn't speak at first, as though the words were trapped inside him. But when he finally did, what he said sent chills down everyone's spine. "I was special to him," Mark whispered repeatedly, his voice barely audible. His parents, confused and frightened, struggled to understand what he meant, but Mark could hardly form a full sentence. His behavior was erratic, and he would break into uncontrollable sobs at random moments. He was clearly traumatized, but no one knew the extent of what he had gone through. The authorities were contacted, and Mark was immediately taken to a local counselor to help him process what had happened. But even the counselor was unable to get a straight answer out of him. The boy kept mumbling about Father Peter, how the priest had promised him something, how he had been given special attention, and how he was the one Father Peter had chosen. Though the town was still largely in denial, those closest to the investigation began to take note of these cryptic statements. Mark's words, though vague, hinted at something deeply unsettling. For the first time, the possibility that Father Peter had played a role in the disappearances couldn't be easily dismissed. It wasn't just that Mark had gone missing. It was the way he spoke about Father Peter, the unshakable connection between them. His words were a thread, and now the investigators could see that there might be a web of secrets tied to the priest. But even with this new evidence, no one wanted to believe it. No one wanted to think that the man who had brought comfort to so many could be hiding something so dark. In the weeks that followed, the investigation took on a new urgency. People began to come forward, but they were still hesitant. They had seen Father Peter with the boys, heard the rumors, but most didn't want to believe it. It would take more than just one child's broken words to shatter the illusion they had all built around him. But with Mark's return, the truth was inching closer, and soon it would be impossible to ignore any longer. As the investigation gained traction, it became increasingly clear that there was more to Father Peter's relationship with the altar boys than anyone had previously suspected. Mark's cryptic statements, along with the growing list of missing children, were no longer isolated incidents or coincidences. The more authorities dug into Father Peter's past, the more unsettling details surfaced. It wasn't just the disappearances. There were whispers of odd behaviors and private meetings with the boys, discrete moments that seemed innocent at first, but now carried a sinister undertone. The most telling discovery came from Father Peter's own records, church attendance logs, personal diaries, and even letters that seemed harmless on the surface but, when examined closely, painted a disturbing picture. In his diaries, the priest had written about certain boys in a way that made many of the investigators uncomfortable. He spoke of them with affection, calling them special, precious, and chosen, phrases that took on a much darker meaning in light of the new evidence. The church had always viewed Father Peter as a dedicated priest, someone who devoted his life to serving his congregation, but these personal notes began to suggest otherwise. The more they learned, the more it seemed that Father Peter had been using his position of power to manipulate those around him, particularly the young boys who trusted him most. The testimonies of former church staff and parishioners began to corroborate the emerging picture. Several workers had seen Father Peter acting inappropriately, spending long hours with specific boys, offering them private counseling, or taking them on overnight trips under the guise of religious retreats. The church had always been a place of comfort, a sanctuary, but for the boys who came under Father Peter's influence, it had become something else entirely, a trap. Yet despite the mounting evidence, no one had concrete proof of what had happened behind the closed doors. No one had seen Father Peter physically harm any of the boys, and there were no clear admissions of guilt. But the pattern was undeniable. Each boy who had gone missing had been close to the priest, each disappearance followed by a chilling silence. The town was slowly waking up to the horrifying possibility that Father Peter's true nature had been hidden behind a mask of charity and faith. Still, the idea that a man they had trusted for so long could be capable of such horrors was almost too much to bear. The more the investigation progressed, the harder it became to deny what was staring them in the face. Father Peter's charm, once his greatest asset, was now his greatest weapon in covering up the truth. As the investigation into Father Peter's actions deepened, it became clear that the priest had spent years building a facade that made him untouchable. Behind the scenes, Father Peter had been carefully crafting his influence, using his position as the trusted priest of the town to shield himself from suspicion. The evidence began to accumulate like a storm, each piece of information more damning than the last. Church records revealed that Father Peter had an unusual amount of private meetings with certain boys, and witnesses reported that he would often take them out of town under the pretense of special church duties. Many of these trips were to remote locations, places where no one would think to look for a priest and his young companions. The testimonies from former church staff painted an even darker picture. Several former altar boys spoke about the special treatment they received, describing how Father Peter would single them out, offering them gifts or privileges that the other children didn't receive. His charm and kindness were intoxicating, and to a young boy, the attention from such a respected figure felt like an honor. But now, those same boys looked back with regret, realizing that what had seemed like benevolent mentoring was, in fact, a carefully executed grooming process. What was most disturbing was the realization that Father Peter had used the church itself as a tool of manipulation. The very space that was supposed to offer sanctuary had instead become a place of control. The boys who trusted him implicitly were isolated from their families, made to feel special, chosen, and even loved in a way that reinforced their loyalty to him. Father Peter had preyed on their vulnerability, using his religious authority, to keep them silent. Many of the boys felt trapped, believing that their relationship with the priest was sacred, something they couldn't question, even as they grew older and started to feel uncomfortable. Father Peter's diary entries added another layer of complexity to the investigation. In them, he wrote about the boys in unsettling detail, describing their appearances, their personalities, and even their weaknesses. His obsession with them had become all-consuming, and as the authorities read through his words, it was clear that Father Peter had been orchestrating a long-running series of manipulations. What initially appeared as a collection of vague notes now felt like a map of his depravity, each line another step toward the horrific truth. The town was slowly beginning to realize the magnitude of the situation, but even as the evidence mounted, many still struggled to believe it. Father Peter's image as a holy man was so deeply ingrained in their minds that the idea of him being capable of such darkness was almost unthinkable. But as the truth unraveled, it became impossible to ignore any longer. The priest they had all trusted had been hiding in plain sight, and the extent of his actions was now painfully clear. The breaking point came when another victim, Lucas, finally found the courage to speak out. He had been one of Father Peter's closest protégés, a young boy who had always looked up to the priest. For years, Lucas had kept his silence, terrified of the consequences of revealing the truth. But as the investigation grew more intense, and as more boys came forward, something inside Lucas snapped. He couldn't bear the weight of his own shame any longer. He knew what had happened to him wasn't right, and it wasn't just him. There were others too. He wasn't alone. Lucas's story was just as chilling as the others, but it was his clarity and bravery in speaking out that made all the difference. He was able to recount how Father Peter had singled him out at a young age, how the priest had made him feel special, how the priest had used his trust and admiration to manipulate him. But the most harrowing part of Lucas's testimony was the way he described the priest's psychological control. Father Peter had convinced him that their bond was sacred, that it was something only the two of them could understand. He was made to feel that no one else could know about their relationship, and any attempt to speak out would mean betraying the church, betraying God himself. It wasn't just physical manipulation. It was emotional, psychological, and spiritual. Lucas spoke about the trips Father Peter would take him on, alone, just the two of them. He had been taken to remote locations, told they were on religious retreats, and promised that the experience would bring them closer to God. But what Lucas hadn't realized at the time was that the trips weren't about spirituality at all. They were about isolation, control, and preparing him for what was to come. In the weeks that followed Lucas's revelation, more victims began to step forward, their stories painfully similar. Many had repressed their memories, convincing themselves that the priest's actions had been innocent, or that they had misunderstood the situation. But as the truth came into focus, more victims found their voices, and the chilling pattern became undeniable. Father Peter had not just been a predator, he had been a master manipulator, using his power as a religious figure to exploit vulnerable boys for years. Each new testimony chipped away at the image of Father Peter as the kind, caring priest the town had once adored. The community was left in shock, struggling to comprehend how the man they had trusted for so long could be capable of such manipulation and betrayal. But with each victim that came forward, the investigation grew stronger, and the truth about Father Peter's dark double life became impossible to deny. As the investigation gathered more momentum, the true extent of Father Peter's abuse became undeniably clear. What had once seemed like isolated incidents, or the misfortunes of a few troubled boys, was now revealed as a long-running series of calculated manipulations and betrayals. Father Peter hadn't simply preyed on a handful of children. He had spent years exploiting his position of power, weaving a complex web of control, isolation, and secrecy that kept the entire town in the dark. The more investigators dug, the more they uncovered. A deeply troubling pattern that spanned multiple towns, with more victims emerging from places Father Peter had served in the past. His reach extended far beyond the small town where he had been most recently. Victims who had never come forward, some living in distant cities, began to recall their own experiences with the priest. They spoke of the same grooming process, how Father Peter had made them feel special, chosen, and loved, in a way that felt like an honor. Some Some had been taken on trips to faraway places. Others had spent time alone with him in his office or at the church. Father Peter was a master of manipulation, convincing each of his victims that their bond was something sacred. They had been led to believe that their loyalty to him and to God required silence and complicity. In some of the other parishes Father Peter had served in, similar disappearances had occurred, though they had never been connected. Families had thought their children had simply run away, or perhaps they'd gotten into trouble, but they hadn't understood the true danger that lurked behind the priest's friendly demeanor. Now, with the town finally piecing together the details, it was clear that Father Peter had been using each of these communities as stepping stones in his predatory behavior. He had moved from place to place, leaving a trail of broken lives in his wake, carefully covering his tracks each time, knowing that his reputation as a trusted religious leader would shield him from suspicion. The trial of Father Peter was a harrowing experience for everyone involved. It wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a painful public reckoning for a town that had been deceived for so long. The courtroom was filled with tension as victims, once silenced by fear and shame, now found themselves standing before the very man who had destroyed their lives. The process was grueling for them, recounting the details of their abuse in front of a room full of strangers, including the community. Members who had once supported Father Peter was a traumatic ordeal, but for many of the victims, it was the only way to reclaim some sense of power over the years of manipulation and control they had endured. Father Peter, now stripped of his clerical robes, sat in the defendant's seat. He no longer had the aura of authority that once surrounded him. His calm demeanor, once so reassuring to his followers, now seemed cold and distant. His eyes, which had once held an almost hypnotic kindness, now reflected something darker: remorse, fear, or perhaps a complete lack of understanding of the magnitude of his actions. Throughout the trial, he maintained his innocence, vehemently, denying the accusations. But the evidence was irrefutable. The testimonies of his victims, the recovered diaries, and the shocking number of children who had suffered at his hands left no room for doubt. The prosecution built a powerful case, showing how Father Peter had carefully groomed his victims over time, using his position of power to manipulate and control them. He had preyed on vulnerable children, convincing them that they were part of something special, something sacred, only to exploit them for his own desires. The defense tried to argue that Father Peter had been a well-meaning priest, misunderstood by those who didn't know him as well as his loyal followers did. But no amount of defense could erase the years of horror that had been hidden behind the priest's carefully cultivated image. As the trial neared its end, the victims began to feel a sense of justice, though it was bittersweet. For many, the trauma would never fully disappear. The scars left by Father Peter's actions were not just physical, they were psychological and emotional. The years of manipulation had warped their sense of self, their understanding of trust, and their view of faith. Some of the victims, still reeling from their experiences, began to seek therapy, working to heal from the wounds they had carried for so long. Others turned to each other for support, finding strength in their shared experiences. The verdict, when it came, was swift and clear. Father Peter was guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison, a punishment that was seen as just by many, though no sentence could truly undo the damage he had caused. For the town, the relief of the trial's conclusion was overshadowed by the realization that their trust had been shattered in a way that could never be fully repaired. Father Peter's conviction brought a sense of closure, but it also marked the beginning of a long, difficult journey for the survivors. The town had been forever changed, its innocence lost, and its belief in its leaders shattered. In the years that followed, the community began to rebuild, though the scars would never fully fade. The church, once the heart of the town, was left empty for long stretches of time. Some parishioners never returned, unable to reconcile their faith with the horrors that had unfolded. Others tried to restore the sense of community, but the shadow of Father Peter's actions loomed large. For the victims, the healing process was long and uncertain, but through it all, they found strength in their voices. They had broken the silence, and in doing so, they had taken the first step toward reclaiming their lives. The town would never forget what had happened, but with time, they began to learn how to move forward, even as the scars of the past remained.